Okay.
So I want to welcome everyone to this webinar, and we're called the Blessings and Curses of Assimilation. We'll explain that title a little bit further. My name is Ted Gong. I'm the Executive Director of the 1882 Foundation, and along with Gary Zola with the American Jewish Archives, we're going to present this seminar or this discussion, and I'm so happy to have you here together. We'll explain further about what we're going to be doing, but I do want to acknowledge right away some of the people that made this possible. And first of all, I want to acknowledge support of the Chinese American Museum in Washington, D.C. We also had support from Asian American Organization of Asian American, OCA, Organization Asian Americans of the DC chapter. And we also have Panda Express, who is helping to sponsor this particular program. Before going any further, I want to point out that this is a webinar that's going to be recorded. Later on, there's also going to be a question and answer segment in which we can ask you. You can express your ideas and thoughts. Try also throughout the time. You can use the chat function, and you can also use the question answer function, and Wei and I will be monitoring that throughout the program, and I would encourage you to have exchanges among yourselves as well as with us, and I'll try to introduce those topics into those questions and comments into the discussion. As I said, at the end, there will be a question and answer segment for the audience. You can raise your hand and ask your questions directly. Be aware that we are recording it. So if you don't want to be recorded, then make sure your mic is off and your image is off. I want to introduce Gary Sola. He's a great scholar, a good friend, and this is our third year of doing this type of programming. And I want him to say a few words on behalf of the American Jewish Archives.
Well, Ted, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. All 100, it looks like, almost people who've joined us so far. We are so grateful to have everyone with us, and especially this wonderful panel. I want to begin by echoing what Ted just said. Everybody knows this month is Jewish American Heritage Month. We're on our very last day. It's also Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and over the last 3 years, for a whole variety of reasons, which we don't need to go into today, but they're all good reasons, we've been seeing a lot of partnering between the Asian American community and the Jewish American community, and I think that's a terrific thing. And I want to echo what Ted has just said. I'm so grateful for this partnership and the friendship that has arisen from it. So as the ancient sages used to say, Ted, in the holy language, Kain Yirbu, which in English means let this continue to fructify. We will continue to do this in the years ahead, and so forth. Before we actually begin, I know that all of us recognize that one element, just one, and not the only one element that has brought us together is the very upsetting and challenging issues that have faced both the Asian American community and the Jewish American community in the last 5-6 years intensively, and that is, of course, acts of bigotry and prejudice that have befallen our community. And that reminds us that before we even begin, our American society, our American civilization, and I'm probably being under-speaking here, is experiencing an illness, a sickness. And part of that sickness has been expressed in the kind of violence and senseless murder that has taken place in the last 10 days. And so we want, as a community, before we begin, we want to pause each person in his, her, their own way. We want to take a few minutes, actually a minute of silence in remembrance of the victims of callous, senseless, brutal bigotry in Buffalo 10, 12 days ago. And of course, more recently, the unspeakable, dastardly, awful violence that was perpetrated on young school children in Uvalde, Texas, and their teachers. So before we enter into a discussion relating to American society and life, let's all take a minute in remembrance, and also, if I might, in hope and prayer that discussions like this can be some kind of antidote for this malady that has befallen our community. Thank you so much. Ted, I put the ball back in your capable hands.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, the topic we're dealing with today is something with Jews and Chinese have dealt with for decades and not centuries. How do we maintain our own identities and still assimilate within the various countries or peoples in which we have lived? And it's especially interesting to find out, for us to discuss, how have we done? What kind of strategies have we as Jews and as Chinese adopted? How successful has we been? How unsuccessful we've been? And we look at the American side particularly, you know, we have done so much. So from the time for the Chinese, from the time that we were 1882 totally excluded from coming to the United States because of the American law that prevented Chinese from coming because they were totally unsuitable to become Americans, unadaptable. We have now become the model minority, right? And how far have the Jews come in terms of their place and successes in economy and politics and so forth? And yet we constantly are continuously looking at things like flare-ups and anti-Semitic actions. And we constantly, as we have seen in most recent months and the year or so, this rise in anti-Asian hate. Now, one of the things we've gotten there, we've assembled a group of the most really bright people. I'm really proud to be part of this group that's going to be discussing these topics. I don't know if we have any answers, but I hope that what we can do in this discussion, which I hope is going to be more of a conversation, and hope that you guys can also be involved in the exchanging ideas for us in the comment and chat session, as well as the question and answer period. We've assembled several, I would call, leading thinkers or practitioners of the questions. And I want to start first with introducing each person to make a few minutes, a couple of minutes to explain who they are, and then also what the type of work they're doing right now. Starting with Ting-Yi, who is our director at the 1882 Foundation, our educational programs. And Ting-Yi, can you say a little bit about your most recent work?
Thank you, Ted. Yes, I'm first of all very happy to be here and to talk about this topic. I come at this as a teacher and as a high school administrator, and how we can teach about assimilating and becoming a part of a greater American nationality, and all of that means. So a lot of my focus in recent time has been how to try to bring about that kind of awareness in schools and through our work with teachers and with students. I come at it particularly because of, I think, the word assimilation and its kind of partner in all this, the melting pot, I find are not particularly useful terms anymore in how we speak about the American immigration process or how people become a part of America. So that's part of what we'll be looking at. Ibram Kendi, who many of you know as in the context of how to be an anti-racist, has raised the question of assimilation as a term that is inherently hierarchical. In other words, people who are trying to assimilate into something, the people who they are assimilating to see them as something that is not quite what they want them to be, and therefore people who are assimilating into that have to adapt and have to change. So that's, I think, one issue that we kind of have to look at as we're going through this. Another thing that I'm speaking with a group last week or a couple of weeks ago with Echoes and Reflections, which is a Holocaust educational group, and also made up of mainly the audience was teachers. How do we begin to look at how we frame that? Because the terms assimilation and melting pot are still very much a part of the standards and the structure of how we are supposed to teach about this. But I opened that session with looking at a quote from Viet Thanh Nguyen, who's a professor out at UCLA, who had, I think, a pretty provocative quote, which goes like this: "What it means to love my country, no matter how it feels about me." And what I take from that quote is the effort on the part of people who are becoming a part of America often work very, very hard to try to make that adaptation, to assimilate, if you will, into that culture. And yet many, many of the things that they try to do aren't successful in that sense, which is why we see the bigotry and the anti-Semitism. One of the things too, just before that presentation was in fact the shootings in Buffalo. And again, if any group has had trouble assimilating into American life, it's African Americans. So it's a kind of a term that, even though you may have been here since the very beginnings, it's not something that is easy to do. So that's where I'm starting from, and I'm really looking forward to being a part of this discussion.
Thank you so much. You know, one of the most great opportunities to meet great new people, Dr. Riv-Ellen Prell is somebody who is, I'm so honored to have her join us, and she teaches at University of Minnesota. I was going to say Michigan, but University of Minnesota. And I'd like to introduce a few words of the type of books you've written, which really addresses those issues that we're talking about.
Thank you. And I'm so grateful to be included in a conversation that's cross-cultural in that sense. So the work that I've done, I've always defined in terms of the term acculturation. Acculturation suggesting that one's culture can stay alive within the context of the larger society, as against assimilation, which in the case of American or European Jews really meant the erasure of difference. But behind acculturation, for both the Chinese experience and the Jewish experience, was always fragile, from Chinese exclusion laws to in the 1880s when Jews began to come to the United States, or the Eastern European group that came, to 1924 when legislation outlawed Jews not so much as Jews, but as people coming from Eastern Europe. And so it was then that Italian and Jews were largely excluded. So we know both this country opening to both of our groups for reasons of labor that were desirable, and then being shut down because of racial hierarchies that have had different consequences for Chinese Americans and American Jews, but to some extent have shaped our time here. My actual interest has always been in particular in gender, and specifically around women, and also social class, to attune us to the fact that assimilation, or specifically acculturation, is never done in general, but around a number of identities, and gender being a very important one. And in fact, that gender, both in Chinese American life and American Jewish life, has been a way in which the dominant culture has turned men and women against each other out of various kinds of anxieties. And that is part of the work that has really shaped my life as a scholar. Our current experiences, especially for Chinese Americans, and this hatred of Asian Americans that we are all experiencing, simply reveals again and again the uncertainty with which any of us are part of this society, falling differently around race than it has around Jewish Americans, but the deep, deep white nationalism and Christian nationalism that operates against Jews as well in a way we haven't seen for a while. So we are in a very complicated time, as the rest of you have noted.
Yes, thank you so much. Welcome. And I want to welcome Dr. Franklin S Odell, a long-term mentor of mine, probably one of my oldest cohorts, is certainly on the 1882 Foundation. And even if as far back as the 1960s, when we're looking at Asian American literature and that kind of stuff like that. But anyway, Dr. Odo, or Franklin, is formerly a great scholar in a lot of books and various things related to Japanese history as well as the Asian American history. And he was the first director of the Asian Pacific Americans program over at Smithsonian, gone through a couple of iterations, now over at Amherst. And if Franklin could maybe say a few words of introduction about your most recent work, that'll be great.
Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be at this company. So where do I start? I grew up in Hawaii, which has always been sort of an outlier among the states. Still is, I think. But those of us who were, and Hawaii is the only state in the Union that has never been majority white. So that's been an interesting experience, because most of us growing up, what we called ourselves local, but it meant people of color, pretty much. And we were not stupid. We understood that back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s, that white people actually, haole, we called them, haole in Native Hawaiian, actually ran the place politically, economically, socially, journalistically, in terms of public health and so on. So for those of us who were, I think there were two avenues. One was a kind of assimilation that was formed and formatted by the fact that there were so many of us. So in my public school education, we hardly encountered white people. And so they were kind of a distant group that we knew of as being a dominant force. We were listening to the radio, watching television, reading the newspapers. So we were aware of the social stratification. But for many of us, you could get by without abandoning many of your traditional cultural patterns and heritages. But there was an unseen hand guiding the disintegration of people's choices about who they were and what they chose to be. And then there were a few of us, particularly of East Asian American extraction, Chinese and Japanese in Hawaii, who either were very smart and were going the traditional academic route, or like myself, had some street smarts, who grew up with a way of, because we were not in areas of power, and our parents were not, our communities were not, were forced to assess where we were and look at the context. And so one of the things that I learned was to try to read people fairly quickly, and got quite good at it. So I bullshitted my way into Princeton, for example. Although I was not a great student, I was okay. But I understood about being in extracurricular activities. So I played sports. I was on the baseball team. I played football for a couple of years. Although that was mostly to attract women because of the uniform. But I knew how the game was sort of played. And later on I want to talk about the fallacy of apparent success, that eventually some of those values that come along with an apparent achievement in acculturation or assimilation or becoming white adjacent are really misleading and harmful to human development, and particularly, and particularly in my case. And I want to see if that exploration resonates with other people as well. So let me stop there.
You know, I want to welcome all three of these wonderful panelists, and I want to return back to Dr. Gary Zola. And when we were talking about this program, he suggested that we read this article, or actually it's a commencement exercise speech, which is actually pretty timely considering where we are in the school schedule, right? And so the idea is the article is called Blessing of Assimilation in Jewish History. And we were talking about it and says, you know, it could also be a curse. And that's some of the things that we want to explore. And I'd like to have Gary maybe talk a little bit more about this article. And then from there, I hope that all of us, the three panelists and all you guys in the chat and the question and answer, can sort of pepper us with various questions as we move along. Gary?
Thank you, Ted. When we were as Ted was saying, we were discussing this, immediately this article came into mind, and I want to talk about it in a second. When I mentioned it to Dr. Prell, I didn't even have to finish the title, and she already knew the article I was talking about, because it's one of those articles that sort of becomes a part of the canon in the academic world, that it is so well known that so many people want to read it, especially relating to the American Jewish experience. And basically what it posits is, and I want to point out something, and here's where we have perhaps some differences between the experience of Asian and the Pacific Asian community, where there's a whole array of different religious traditions that comprise the Asian community. Jews may argue about what is best for its religious tradition, but we all subscribe to what we call Judaism. And, there's this idea in Judaism and in the religion that the further back you go, the closer you get to Mount Sinai, the more true you have in terms of what is really important. And that the more you progress and you get further away from that important magical moment, the less accurate you are in terms of what really happened. And that, of course, runs against the scientific idea of progressivism, which is that the more we learn and the more knowledge we gain about the world, the more we know and the more progress we make in terms of humankind. It's diametrically opposed. So the author of this article, Dr. Gerson Cohen of blessed memory, was a very distinguished historian, and he actually rose to become the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And he gave this commencement address, and with the fetching title, The Blessings of Assimilation. And basically, he points out the following. He says that if we're going to speak scientifically and historically, then you just have to observe and just take note of the fact that the Jewish experience in every single way has acculturated, and I'm borrowing the word that Dr. Prell used, assimilated to some degree in every chapter of its history, wherever it was, and that there is no such thing as an unadulterated Judaism, if I use that word, meaning that a Judaism that was created on Mount Sinai and has continued on without any change or any modification up till the present time, that's a myth. It doesn't happen, and that we have always been impacted by the culture. And the important point that he makes, of many, is that this is a blessing, because the purpose of acculturation, by and large, was not to see to it that we disappear into the larger culture, but rather the purpose was to make the historic experience relevant to each and every period of time. And that was a good thing because that gave it life and renewed it every generation. Now, I'm going to conclude with this sort of laying it out because I want to focus on the American Jewish experience since that's my area of interest in particular. And I want to talk about two scholars who sort of focused on this issue. One is Professor Jonathan Sarna, and the other is Professor Sylvia Barak-Fishman, both of whom teach or taught at Brandeis University. And they both posit the same concept. They call it, they have different terminology, but it's basically the same concept. They argue that in America, the way that Jews have actualized and made real what Dr. Cohen observed as the blessings of assimilation are that we have basically made the case that if something is truly American, purely American, connected to the great ideals of the American founders, then it's Jewish. And if something is Jewish, meaning comes from our Jewish tradition, then it is without question American. And Dr. Sarna refers to this as the cult of synthesis, meaning by the word cult that it means it's almost a religious conviction that if you are a good Jew, there is nothing about being a good Jew that prevents you from being a good American. And if you're a good American, there's nothing about being a good American that inhibits you from being connected to your Jewish heritage, that there's nothing mutually exclusive. Dr. Barak-Fishman, I think, refers to it as coalescence. But it's the same thing. It's the idea that there cannot be any difference. And when we're confronted with the what we would call being hit in the face with those contradictions, when it doesn't work out, I think when we were talking, Ted, I used the example of what happens when school opens on the New Year, the Jewish New Year, or on the Day of Atonement, or what happens when the High Holy Days fall on the World Series championship or whatever. Then suddenly, how can you do both? How can you be attending synagogue and being a part of the American, if you will, secular religion? Well, then when those things happen, we have to resolve them, and we find ways to resolve them. I'll end with a very important quote from Dr. Cohen's article, because I think it's a good way to introduce the topic to the rest of the speakers and let them comment on it. He says, and I'm quoting from this very famous article, he says, assimilation, properly channeled and exploited, can become a blessing. The great ages of Jewish creativity were born out of a response to the challenge of assimilation. And there is no reason why our age should not respond to this challenge with equal vigor. But then he says, assimilation is not a one-way street. And he says, therefore, he goes on to say that means that it has to be properly channeled so that it remains fundamentally a blessing and not a curse. I'll stop there, and I'd love to hear what others have to say, either on that topic, or what I was sort of talking about, or cognate related issues. Okay, how's that?
Sounds good. I I'm gonna single out somebody while everybody else is thinking about the responses. Ting-Yi, you know, this idea that there is, if it's Jewish, it's American. If it's American, it's Jewish. And we often are looking at the idea, what distinguishes us as Asian or Chinese American or Chinese versus American. And we're always constantly battling that question. Part of it is also important for us to understand, how do we survive? And that's another question we want to look at too, is these ideas of, we assume that assimilation is always the good thing, that's the objective, but maybe it's not. There may be other things involved as well.
So thank you, Gary, first for laying out, I think, a number of the large ideas that are part of Cohen's commencement speech. I identify with that a lot because I think, I mean, more or less by age, you know, I could have been almost in that audience listening to that speech at the time. And so you have to take a little bit of a grain of salt, I think, in terms of, you know, the maybe a little bit of a dated quality of it, and then certainly some of the language maybe that's used, particularly in use of the term assimilation itself. So I found that kind of just interesting as I was reading it and projecting back to my own, you know, life. And I think there was this sense of assimilation, and something that I went through as Franklin was talking also about how one tries to lead one's life as being part of a group that is accepted. I think one major takeaway that I have from this, and this is more, I think, to your question or your point, Ted, that you just raised here, is there's something that he referred to as healthy and unhealthy assimilation. And I think that's really an important concept, because from an immigrant's point of view, or someone who is on the outside trying to feel a way to fit in, there is this sense of survival, of how do you make yourself acceptable and how do you make yourself really a part of this. And it's part of a survival instinct. So there's that healthy side where you take on those trappings of the dominant culture and you try to you know, become what it is. And you don't even necessarily do this consciously. Franklin was talking about sports. And that's a way, of course, of very much finding a way in if you're participating and involving yourself with that. And, you know, Gary also mentions things like the World Series conflict. One of my big memories as a child is, why is Sandy Koufax not pitching for the Dodgers, you know, in this, you know, particular game when the World Series is opening? But, you know, he had to honor his holy days. So, and he wasn't necessarily even all that devout and practicing Jew, but he, you know, it was important enough for him to make sure that other people understood that. I think one key difference for looking at the Chinese experience and the Asian American experience is that one aspect of where you get to be a part of the country is through citizenship. And the Exclusion Acts, 1882, that denied Chinese the right to become citizens. Well, how can you participate? How can you be a civic participant in the very kind of life of the country when you can't even become a citizen? You can't vote. So I think that's maybe a key factor to look at when we're looking at the differences. So that becomes an important part of it. And also Chinese, from the very language that was used by legislators when the Exclusion Acts were created, talked about them, Chinese being unassimilable. They just couldn't be a part of it. They didn't have the right language. They ate crazy food. They, you know, they didn't behave in correct ways. They wore this hair in a long queue that didn't make any sense to Americans if you really wanted to become part of the country, even though there were good reasons for why that might have to happen. So I think that's one idea that I really would like to take away, is there are good ways of having this healthy assimilation, and also unhealthy ones that also, I think Dr. Prell was talking about ones that an aspect where you're, there's an aspect of your identity that's erased. And Cohen also spoke about that. If there's something where your identity gets obliterated in the process, that obviously is not a healthy assimilation. So there is that balance that we started off in talking about. How do we take what is important about becoming American versus those things where you're really in danger of losing your identity?
Yeah, and in the case of Chinese and some of the Asians and other people, it's not only a matter of losing your identity, it's a matter of losing your life, right? So, Dr. Prell, would you like to add to the conversation going forward? I see you nodding a couple of times on things which Ting-Yi mentioned.
Well, as Gary Zola will tell you, not all scholars agree. No big surprise there. So I would say that one of the great privileges of coming of age as a baby boomer in the 60s was the opportunity to rethink the nature of America that was definitely created in my lifetime in the first foundational way through the civil rights movement. But of course, it was there before that in the labor movement and a variety of other places. And the civil rights movement, as I'm sure many of our participants know, became an extraordinary model for many forms of what we call identity-based activism. But of course, we came of age in identity. It was the model of a white Protestant, ideal male as the leader, to a dramatic rethinking of American history and American culture that first revealed the impossibility of assimilation for virtually anyone who was not white and Protestant, and at the same time, a rethinking of the nation. So if you go back to a thinker like W.E.B. Du Bois, or generation after generation of immigrants, they loved and believed in the American ideal that they saw the dominant culture constantly corrupting and undermining. And I do think I appreciate the work of my colleagues, Professors Fishman and Sarna, who really held out for this kind of idea. But as American Jewish history came of age in this period of time, we know there was constant resistance against assimilation or even different ideas of acculturation, which is to say that groups have always been complex. There have always been resistors. There have always been people who wanted to rethink how to negotiate and how to call America to account for its failures as, in so many ways, a supremacist society for which Chinese exclusion and the denial of citizenship was absolutely at the core of that. So I would say that we have a tremendous heritage from those of us who were not part of the dominant culture. Maybe our parents, others fought to be in it. Maybe those of us who were viewed as white were able from the beginning to hold some strength in it, but to have come of age, not just as an individual, but as a scholar, or to be trained in that period where we rethought the complexity of American culture, we came to understand the falseness of assimilation. And there's a lot to be said about Gerson Cohn. It's a very touching article. He actually was speaking at a graduation for Hebrew teachers. He so passionately believed in that possibility of a more dynamic understanding of Jewishness, but it was a long time ago. And a lot has happened since then.
Yeah, certainly. Assimilation, if it's meant to be like what we used to think about in terms of what do we call ourselves, the melting pot, and you had to change yourself into essentially a white American or something this sort. In the time that we grew up, like Franklin and I, it really was part of the civil rights, and the assertion of your own identity, which was almost anti-assimilation, was to assert your own worth, your own value. And Franklin, I know you have this activist element in your background, and maybe you could speak to a little bit about what Riv-Ellen is talking about and how that fits today in some of the ideas that we've thought about. How do you maintain yourself as and all the traditions that are there, but still claim and define our place in America?
I'll try. I think this is a complex issue that requires a lot more time. But let me start by saying, I started out by talking about assimilation as a dangerous path for individuals. And I would just point out that the single most group in American society today are prone vulnerable to suicide ideation is Asian American young women.
Is that right?
Yeah, and it's a problem for high school and college age kids, and it has and it's a lethal image that is being contested in a number of psychological journals and mental health issues. But related to that, I think, is the fact that many of these kids who are thinking of self-harm as a way out of this dilemma called life, are children of immigrant parents who have extraordinary expectations of their kids. And so I've been looking fairly carefully at the Harvard affirmative action case, which all of us know comes before the Supreme Court this fall. And all expectations are that this conservative court will rule against the consideration of race at all in admissions policies in elite public and private institutions. And so in that light, and they're mostly Chinese immigrant parents, by the way, who are in the group that comprises the plaintiff group in the Harvard case. So looking at that carefully reminds me of the model minority myth. So I've been teaching a class at Amherst College for the last few years called the model minority myth, Asian and Jewish Americans. And my colleague, Wendy Berghoffen, does Jewish American studies, is married to a Japanese American scholar colleague of mine, and I'm married to a Jewish American woman, have been for longer than I want to reveal. Anyway, over half a decade. And so what I wanted to say is that some of what we've found is that what makes the model minority myth that applied to Jews, particularly in the 20s, when the whole the whole sort of panoply of values was designed by Harvard to begin with to minimize the number of Jews who would be admitted to Harvard, and other Ivies followed that path. And that was to do geographical distribution, because a lot of Jews came from New York City. So geographical distribution helped that cause. Extracurricular activities, leadership, sports, all of that stuff is relatively, well, it's 100 years old now. And now we're going to have to rethink some of this if we want to think about what kind of society we really want to live in, because this is clearly aimed at Black and brown populations. So for the Chinese immigrant parents, sometimes have had to personally intervene with their kids to help protect them in terms of what they wanted to study, that was not in line with the parents' expectations of assimilating into American society, becoming a doctor or a lawyer or engineer or IT professional. And I'm sorry I'm taking so long. I wanted to just say some of the same qualities that are promulgated and proffered as elements of success by minorities that have become models, like Jews and Asians, include things like hard work or work ethic, or deferral of gratification, or commitment to homeland values. But in times when it's convenient for white supremacist groups to turn on us, hard work and a work ethic become slavish, cheap labor, labor that threatens real jobs for real Americans. Deferral of gratification becomes slavish devotion to community actions that simply are inhuman conditions of living on a grain of rice a day or something, these kinds of qualities that allow for denigration of cultural values or values that were in good times attributed to groups as positive, are very easily turned, the double-edged swords that are easily turned into weapons and weaponized against us when it's convenient.
Yeah. So that's the question, Gary and others, that we being all of us in the diaspora have done things to make ourselves successful. Like I said, the great switch from the time when we were Chinese were noted to be totally unassimilable. And now we've become the model minority for other people. And the Jews have been so successful in so many areas, right? Politically, commercially, etc. There's also a wider nuance of populations in the society. But as soon as something, what is it that then persists in this American narrative or other countries that are looking at us as something that is can be attacked, despite all that have done in terms of our quote unquote assimilation, or to taking on different ways and actually showing success? Why then are we constantly there's constantly this anti-Semitic move, and there's constantly this anti-Asian activities going on? What is that? Is it something inherently in white nationalism, or white people that just sort of like hate us and looking for an excuse to hate us, something like that? How do we deal with that? We teach, as Ting-Yi does, he's constantly teaching in the classrooms about how to look at these things. And we're always talking about how do we build coalitions to address these issues. And in the end, something flares up and it's the China flu and they should get out of the country, or there should be something else, or there's an attack on a synagogue for whatever reason, we don't know.
Well, I think I'd first like, if she is willing to, I'd like to defer to Riv-Ellen, because I know she's given a lot of thought to this, has written about in related to this question. So, am I putting you on the spot? If I am, I don't mean to.
No, not. I mean, I'm happy to answer, but obviously, I'm not the only person on the screen who has a perspective on this, and this is a tremendously complicated issue, because we can talk about the undercurrents in this society that do not go away, but we know that there are political realities and historic moments that make these come to fruition. So, I mean, Hannah Arendt, whose work on the origins of totalitarianism talks about a dynamic of deep loneliness for people who are disconnected from communities, from a sense of connection to others, of meaningful work, of a variety of things. And as people have pointed out, this is so much more true because of media. And we know that the digital world has made available to people who may be occupying these kinds of experiences that can easily teach them about the great replacement theory, or the importance of whiteness, or all alien groups that are here. I mean, there are people who look at economic explanations because of deindustrialization in parts of the country that thanks to globalization economically have left people very isolated. I mean, there are economic explanations, there are other kinds of explanations, but I think it's maybe worth saying in this context that while some of these are very much transnational, you can find them in Europe, you can find them in the United States. The United States is based on ideas of a racially superior group. and that anyone outside of that group, and Jews have sometimes been seen to some extent as a racial grouping in the United States, people outside that group threaten the dominant culture in some sense. And so for whatever reason, you can draw on that. W.E.B. Du Bois, to go back to him, used a phrase to talk about the wages of whiteness. When you have nothing else going for you as a laborer, your whiteness makes you different than those around you. So these are long standing in the very foundations of this country, which begins with slavery and despoiling indigenous people, that can flare up in various times. And there are groups that were underground after World War II, then they explode back up. But there's no question that we are looking at transnational ideas, but ideas that are very meaningful in this country. Why now? Well, we know we have never been more polarized, and we know we had a form of leadership that called it the China disease, who has unloosened the tongues of people who are making use of this. And we know that this is a terrifying moment in terms of the attack on democracy and on the illegitimacy of those people who cannot be counted within some kind of groups who imagine themselves as white and under attack, no matter how inaccurate they are. So to say that this is a 2-minute explanation that is absurdly simplified, at least it, provides some conversation to invite the other panelists into.
If I can pick up on, I think, two words really that Riv-Ellen just used. One is the threat. When it becomes perceived as a threat from a particular group, whatever it may be, then you suddenly see things turn. And then also it triggers the survival aspect of the group that is now being under attack. So there's this kind of reaction to the perceived threat that a group might have. So whether it's African Americans and their striving for freedom in the civil rights movement, or even as recently as the George Floyd type of thing that galvanized people, you see this reaction on the part of white Americans that suddenly says, oh, there's something wrong with this country. Who are these people? What makes them the way they are? And that becomes a challenge for us to really be able to look at our own history, our own experiences, and see how we can somehow turn that around. And it also goes to Cohen's point in the article that he mentions, that when there are, I think, crises like these, and you're forced to re-examine your position within the society, it is also, though, an opportunity. This is a time, perhaps, for being able to think creatively, think of different ways of how you look at your own identity. I think this has been very true of, say, the Asian American community in the last year, as it has come under attack in many ways that it had not seen in a long time. So there's an attempt by individuals to really pull together. I think Gary used a phrase way back when we were talking about this in the first place, oppression of the united, so that it's when you're feeling that you're being oppressed as a group that you somehow find a way to galvanize yourselves into speaking out and finding a way to reimagine how this world might work.
I think Dr. Odo, you had your hand up, and please.
I thought that was an affirmation of Riv-Ellen's statement, but I did. Yes, this is a very interesting kind of question, and I'm wondering what we haven't discussed yet, which might be a little bit more off target or too extreme for this particular panel. But I'm wondering, I'm thinking back to what is it that I was trying to assimilate into? I mean, yes, the original, I guess the original goal was to be as close as possible to a WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's changed some. So Jack Kennedy, the first John in the White House, you know, that kind of thing. So Catholics are probably okay today. Southern Eastern Europeans are okay today, except for Jews. So Ukrainians in particular, as refugees, are welcome, but not people from sub-Saharan Africa or south of the border, immediate border. So there may be, it may be that there is an absolute limit, a red line, so to speak, for white supremacists that cuts us off with people of color, maybe even LGBTQ. I'm not sure about that because there's so many LGBTQ people among white supremacists. So who knows? The line is maybe a little flexible still. I have trouble imagining, given our history, that Asian Americans are going to actually become part of the new group that is welcomed, like Italians or Poles, who were so demonized back in the earlier 19th century and later 19th century, because they were part of the group that was marginalized in terms of quotas in the 1924 Act that Riv-Ellen referred to. So if that's the case, then those of us Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders who are trying to assimilate into that particular select group that has, yes, expanded its borders or its parameters, but may have met the limits of its willingness to expand its borders. If that society, if that group is willing to expand the inclusivity to all of the rest of us, then we're thinking about an America that we may all envision. But if not, then we have a problem for a very long time. And then we have to think about different kinds of strategies for resolving that problem. Including how we as people who are demonized and marginalized at this point strategize in terms of what it is that we're trying to acculturate or assimilate into.
Yeah. I mean,
you know, we might look at this. Here's a little contribution on my part, and I know we want to get to some questions now, but just one last thought is, I think it was Dr. King, among probably many others, who pointed out that, you know, the founders, the male founders of the nation who conceived of the great and noble documents, that their rhetoric was almost cosmic in its nature. You know, all are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and so forth and so on. And yet, at this very moment, as they were creating these ideas, that which became actualized was as Riv-Ellen pointed out, born in this sort of, what was minted into this was racism and white superiority and male dominance and on and on. So for me, as I really sort of analyze the history of the American Jew, when we're faced with that kind of ugliness, it seems there's an instinct to fight for the rhetoric, for the nobility of the ideas. In other words, to actualize that which the words which, or the idea that they gave birth to, as opposed to what they in fact was minted into the society itself. Whether that's doable or not is a different question. But if it's not doable, then I think what Dr. Odell has just said is something we all need to take seriously, which is we may need to think about an entirely different strategy. Because as I read the past, and it's just me personally, that's whenever confronted with that kind of bigotry, the Jew has turned to the Constitution and to the Declaration of Independence and has argued about the ideas of America. And and if we could actualize the ideas, then the issues we're talking about would evaporate. But whether or not that can happen, because impressed into the literal birth channel of it was these issues that Dr. Prell pointed out, it makes it a very complicated issue. I know we want to get to questions, but I don't want to just speak ex cathedra if somebody wants to add on to that.
Yeah, we should, yes, Dr. Prell.
I just want to make one quick response, which is, as minority groups, we are not all the same. So it was certainly very compelling that the Harvard case had Chinese American families on both sides. Some very much, well, they were on both sides. And it is the case that there are Jewish Americans who stand for certain political ideas and support certain political figures and love Tucker Carlson. And that is still so shocking to me and makes me so happy my parents are not alive to have seen this, because this would have been unimaginable, because you had this sense that Jews had a certain consensus exactly of the kind that Gary Zola is articulating. And it's important for us to know that we may find alliances across on shared agreement that will make us different than other members of our own group. And so that members of our group may see the same forms of racism that horrify us, and they just say, well, that's not about us. And especially for groups that have, as both of Chinese Americans and Jewish Americans, who have achieved certain kinds of economic registers and all of that, I just think it's useful for us to make sure that we don't communicate to anyone or to ourselves, we all think the same within our groups. Wouldn't it be nice if it worked that way? Because I agree that racism and anti-Semitism can create great solidarity, but it doesn't work as well, in my view, as that used to. And maybe that is because of economic differences or all kinds of complicated issues. But that doesn't mean that we can't find alliances with those of us who want to make these struggles together. So I'll end there. I'm sorry.
I think raising a number of questions, a lot of things. For example, we talk about assimilation. The question, what are we assimilating to? And it's changing. Why? What is the compelling reason to assimilate? We always say that it's supposed to be a positive thing to assimilate. Maybe that term is not right. Some of our guests are saying things, should we be talking about acculturating or adapting, and as opposed to assimilation, to be the same as those other people? But how do we adjust so that we are working together? Certainly the things that I think, I know Frank is interested in, and Dr. Prell is interested in, that coalition building is also another issue. It's an idea that if you want political action, you have to figure out how do you build coalitions to get things done, right? And so there will always be conflict. And I, for one, hope that we continue to have differences, because how boring it would be if everybody agreed to everything that everybody said. So, Dr. Cohen made a comment I kind of put in my mind, where he said that the thing that in terms of assimilation, turns you have to, first of all, he said, what do you do if you're a Jew, and we can all say Chinese, that when you say, okay, you have to maintain your identity, and then the reaction to changes or the assaults on your community are going to be, you're either going to falsify, become tradition bound, or you're going to have to figure out a way to adapt or accommodate those forces that are around you to do things. If the forces are such that they're white nationalists, you don't necessarily want to join with them, but you also have to figure out a way to work and survive in that area, that adapt things. You have, and I think part of the things he says is that, if I read it right, and Gary, everyone else will tell me that, Ted, you're way off base. But the idea is that, if we assume that maintaining our Jewish identity or maintaining our Chinese identity expressed in our traditions are so important for us, and so therefore I'm going to emphasize and reinforce all my traditions, then maybe that's one strategy to take. Or in the case he talks about, maintaining language. You don't, in a sense, don't talk the other guy's language. You just reinforce your own sense of community through language. But he makes the point that Jewish culture and tradition is actually strengthened by the fact that you have adapted to say either Greek or to English or something of this sort, because it allows you to express and continue the traditions beyond that one group that you emerged from in that one decade. So you can actually talk about Jewish tradition or Chinese tradition in a much adaptable, stronger way. In a way, it maintains the relevance, and I like that use of the term, maintains the relevance of the tradition to today's questions. And that provides something for our future generation to build upon. So what I'd like to do is, if any of those things stimulate some discussion of the speakers, and now the audience is putting up some questions, various things that you guys can maybe take up.
I'll tell you, Ted, one question that I think we may not be able to get into in a serious way, but it's important because one or two people have raised the issue that, well, if you're wearing your minority status on your physical being, so your skin is black, or you have features that are obviously noticeable, or you're wearing what we might call identifiable Jewish garb, so that even if your face may be white, you're communicating to the outer world precisely who you are. That is a kind of, I'm now trying to paraphrase what one of a couple of the questioners, that's a kind of challenge that someone who looks like Gary Zola is not necessarily facing, because I could be and have been often mistaken for an Irishman. So yet I think, but maybe not, Riv-Ellen pointed out that, I think I heard this, that that is, we're now in the Jewish community, we're sort of facing a racial, racial kind of bigotry, despite all of that, which is often hard for the African American or the Asian to appreciate or to understand, because if we have white faces and we you can't identify us as Jews just by looking at us, how can you say you're experiencing any kind of racial? This, of course, came to a head with Whoopi Goldberg's incident where she mentioned this on TV, and we're living at a time where maybe talking about the differences of time, maybe 40 years ago we would have accepted that, and yet now it seems more and more that racialism and racist behavior, it can even befall people who don't necessarily have that kind of immediate recognition. But there were several questions about that, and maybe others of you want to speak to that, because I think it's something that's raised a lot in terms of Jews as a minority versus others.
Mm-hmm.
I have a thought to add along that line. One of the questions is, can you think of strategies that really worked before the majority evolved, quote, on their own terms? And I think there's a way of kind of looking at the kinds of progress that people of color, minorities have made over the years, where it's a lot of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, not just a step back. And I think we're in one of those moments right now where we see a lot of the bigotry that has come forward. But I think there are elements where you can see how different ethnicities, different groups have had a profound impact on the culture of the majority society. You think of food, you think of dance, you think of all, particularly in the arts. And this is where we see an evolving change in the overall population towards those minority groups. Speaking to Gary's point, I've often been mistaken. I'm half Chinese, half Dutch, but growing up in New York, I was often presumed to be maybe Puerto Rican or a Jew. So there were these things where in my own life, particularly in the community where I was growing up, that my identity was somewhat unfixed and not really, seen in the way that it was. And I'm thinking too that in another way of maybe looking at acculturation versus adaptation versus assimilation is the flip side of that, which we are, calling cultural appropriation, where one group, mainly whites, are taking and borrowing what they see from other groups and, quote, making it their own. So it does work in this other way, and it forces groups within minority groups to reappraise their own contributions, if you will. And is it all right for white Americans to take on those aspects of your traditions? I was taken, and I just kind of rewatched some of this the other day, but there was a documentary produced a few years back called The Search for General Tso, about General Tso's chicken and how that is a staple of every single Chinese restaurant around the country. And it is a homogenizing influence in the sense of the United States. You get a variety of General Tso's chicken that's unique to New Orleans, another one that's maybe to San Francisco, another one in New York, but all Americans kind of embrace this. So this is kind of a weird, maybe transition of how some of these things, work. But going back to a point that I was trying to make for, and Riv-Ellen also was making here, there is something where people can be comfortable with that and accepting of it to a point. And then all of a sudden something happens and now it is perceived as a threat. And everybody kind of goes back to their survival mode. And how is it that we can really come and make a difference that moves the country forward, upholds those values in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence that we're all supposed to be bound by.
So we're coming to the 6:15 mark and we're going to start closing down. So I'd just like to maybe ask each of you to make some final remarks or comments. And I wonder, one question I saw in here is, are we Jews and Jewish Americans, Chinese Americans, stronger? Is our tradition the one that helps identify us, that identifies and we subscribe to? Are we stronger because of the challenges that we've had to face to deal with all these anti-Semitic and anti-Asian hate issues? That how does that help us define ourselves, and whether it's a stronger or better form? Maybe Gary, I'm gonna save you for last because you're part of the co-sponsoring. So that means Riv-Ellen, can you you don't have to answer that, talk about that, but we're at the final comments and closing comment section.
So I think the issue of the experience of oppression can articulate itself in many ways. It can create a sense of understanding of others. It can build alliances. It can open that possibility. And that has a long tradition, very much among secular Jews, among Gary's denomination, Reform Judaism, and the incredible role of the rabbinate around the civil rights movement. I mean, it can really build connections. Mm-hmm. It can also make people angry, mean-spirited, believe that their group is the only one who suffers and not find a way to alliance. So it's hard to generalize. I think it's very important to hold up what being an object of hatred can do, especially in the context of the United States, to call the nation to a different kind of setting. What I do see certainly in university life, particularly for Asian American and Pacific, is very strong senses of connection within and across groups that often did not feel that sense of connection. That's really been the case for me to see over the years that I taught. But I do think to in any way not suggest that we are in a moment where democracy is under attack, where white supremacy it's not the majority view, it's only, honestly, white Christian nationalism defines more than 20% of the Republican Party. So I think what I would say is we have no time to lose.
Yes.
We need to acknowledge this. We need to understand it. We need to find points of connection to support one another. And I have daughters in their late 30s and early 40s. I have grandchildren. I'm worried about the future of the nation. And I feel honored to have been in this conversation to really share this with you and those who are with us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. Ting-Yi, final word from you, closing remarks. You have to unmute.
Yeah. There's a question here right at the end that someone's posed. What do you think the situation will be in 1 or 2 generations, where more and more people will be biracial and multiracial? And it ties really to something that I thought of a closing here that also fits in very well with this notion of building connections and a vision that we have for the future. And as a teacher, this is what we're all about, right? We're looking towards the future, and the children are our hope for the future. And in one of these presentations that I have given before, there's a letter that was written by Isaac Landman. He was the editor of the Hebrew Weekly. It was written way back in 1924. And that, of course, was the year that the very, very strong, basically limiting immigration quota laws were put in that so restricted Jewish immigration and, of course, continued the exclusion of Asians into the country. But he was addressing this letter from Isaac Landman. He was addressing this letter to W.E.B. Du Bois. And he wrote, "We have chosen you among a few other progressive men and women to give us your conception of the state of America in which our children's children, meaning 2020, will live. We can conceive of no theme which so fires the imagination as this attempt to discover the future." Well, if we project ourselves now, roughly 100 years now into the future, I think that gets at the question, I think it was Betty, was her name, who posed the question here.
Yeah.
What is it that we hope for? What is the vision?
Yeah.
And as a teacher too, looking at this, it's to me a wonderful assessment to give to kids, to have them project in their view now what they see the country looking like 100 years from now or 80 years from now.
Yeah.
And
they can
go
learn
from
from
there.
Yeah, learn from all these discussions and the fact that we're continuing this discussion after the 14th Amendment 150 years ago. That Franklin, final words, comments?
2 things occur to me. First of all, the people who espouse replacement theory really don't have that much to worry about. One of the things that I try to do with teaching identity issues with my Asian American students is that our groups are not sacrosanct, and our groups have all the flaws that other groups have as well. We're just as corrupt, just as liable to extortion, just as evil as anybody else. And so when we share in power positions, things that if that's all that is that changes, that the faces at the table and pulling the levers of power include all of us, the society won't change very much. A little.
I think that idea of being inclusion.
Yeah, so they don't have anything particularly to worry about the nature of society. The second is in terms of where we want to go and how to get there. I'm not sure. I have my own ideas on where we want to go, and they may be not acceptable to a lot of people. But I do think that one thing that would be universally received is people should actually learn left brain side. I do believe affective right brain side is important, but we're uniquely positioned to be able to provide histories, interpretations, and so on. And this can happen in a lot of different ways. And the young people really need this, and as well as immigrant parents or grandparents. I mean, I think older folks are able to learn, and I do hope we don't give up on them.
Good. You know, Gary, it is always such a pleasure to be with you and talk about different things. And I leave you with the final word too.
Well, I really appreciated those words from Ting-Yi and from Franklin and from Riv-Ellen, beautiful thoughts. I'm just going to quickly say that, you know, we have really, when it comes down to it, we're talking about a future of our nation. And, you know, do we envision the nation as being more beautiful and more meaningful and more loving because of variety and differences that can be respected? Or do we envision a homogenization? And just, and I mean this in the most broad sense possible. So I'm a partisan for the former and not the latter. And I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this beyond the Jewish community. And I want to conclude by wishing all those who are still with us either a very happy last day of Jewish American Heritage Month or Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And I want to thank Ted and the 1882 Foundation and my co-panelists for this wonderful tradition. Let's make it a tradition. You know, in Judaism, that's a big thing. We're always want to transform things into a tradition. So let's make this a tradition for this special month where we can always find good things to talk about and make our world a better place. Thank you, Ted, so much for being such a gracious moderator.
I want to thank all of you guys for participating, and some people at the very last minute. Thank you very much. Well, to Dr. Prell, Dr. Zola, Dr. Odell, and also not quite Dr. Oei, but we'll call you that. Anyway, thank you so much. And I also want to thank in the background, Lisa Franco for being our host, technical person to watch out for us. And Wei is always there in the background, helping to make sure that I don't stumble somewhere and I get stuck in some technical loop somewhere. So I want to thank all of you guys for that. I also want to thank again the program sponsors that we have. Chinese American Museum of Washington, D.C. just opened. Go over there, take a look. We also have OCA, the D.C. chapter. And we also have Panda Express who help us support some of our programs. So thank you all for coming here, and all the audience for participating. Stay tuned to 1882 Foundation. We have monthly events, which we call Talk Stories or Timeless Echoes, in which we take on topics on this type of forum. And next one that might be of particular interest to other people. There'll be a few things coming up in July. One of them is that we're going to be talking with film producers of 3 Chinese American film producers who produce separate documentaries on Chinese Americans growing up in Jim Crow South and what that all means. We'll have an African American moderator, and we're trying to develop a program in which our topics are not just siloed, but also draw in other groups of people to talk about these important topics. Other things that are coming up, particularly Gary will be very interested in, is that we're going to try to revive a talk story on how to play mahjong, and we're going to have both Jewish and Chinese together. And we're hopeful also that Wei is particularly excited because he says, let's do a supper club, and let's do a supper club on Christmas night. right? So that
Oh,
we can
that's a good
have the
idea.
community.
That's a good, yeah,
Yeah,
there's a couple of books written about that. So,
exactly right. Then we can have a lamp prize, things like that. So anyway, take a look at our 1882foundation.org and follow us if you care to, which we hope you do. And again, thank you all so much for being a fine audience and attentive audience, and some very fantastic questions, which I wish we had more time to explore. Join us. We'll try to do that again later. Thank you very much.
thank you so much, everybody. Take good care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.